Today we need to look at and learn about the president's power with regards to foreign relations. And this is typically one of the most cited powers or one of the most cited concerns we have as a nation when we elect a president, because obviously we have a history in the 20th and 21st century, and even before that, of the need for stability and the role of the United States in helping to create that stability for ourselves, our allies, and for the rest of the world. President Kennedy, who you see pictured here, in a 1961 radio broadcast, described the pressures of the presidency in this way. He said, "When I ran for the presidency, I knew the country faced serious challenges, but I could not realize, nor could any man who does not bear the burdens of this office, realize how heavy and constant would be those burdens." And I think when we look at the role of the president in foreign affairs, this becomes the key part we have to understand. The pressure that the president faces, the single person who is in charge of the safety and security of our nation, our allies, our outposts around the world, our troops, and the people and the interests that we have in the world. That is a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of responsibility. So let's dive into how, in fact, the president operates within those foreign affairs powers. At the outset, we need to have some key terms defined and ready to go as we talk about these things. We're going to be talking about treaties and executive agreements. They do virtually the same thing, but they're fundamentally different. We need to talk about the power of recognition and how the president uses the power of recognition as a diplomatic and foreign policy tool, and the idea of a persona non grata. So let's keep going. When we talk about the power to make treaties, it's one of the president's pieces that he uses as chief diplomat, right? So as chief diplomat, you have to negotiate treaties with other countries as it benefits the United States economically, strategically, or militarily. The job of the president is to ensure that our interests are represented in those negotiations. They might be bilateral negotiations between us and another country. They might be trilateral with three, whatever the case is, multilateral, where you've got a lot of different forces in play there. But the president, as chief diplomat, is charged with negotiating those treaties. And then, in order for those treaties to have the force of law, the president presents those treaties to the Congress, to the Senate particularly, for their advice and consent, their constitutional power within the treaty-making process. The Senate must vote to approve those with a 2/3 majority, and once they are approved, then the president ratifies that treaty by sending it to the other nations, and they put that treaty in force. So that advice and consent role that the Senate plays is part of the original Constitution that the framers had intended. Now, let's talk about the checks and balances, right? The fundamental idea of checks and balances is to ensure that the United States president does not enter into agreements that are against the best interests of the people. Now remember, the people of the Senate are elected by the states, and they represent the interests of the states, and so therefore they have a particular role and purpose in this discussion. Now, of course, one of the most famous examples of this is the fact that the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. After World War I, the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, the United States, under President Wilson, had negotiated this peace treaty in the Treaty of Versailles. But in particular, that treaty, some senators thought, ceded authority and ceded power to the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, they felt, was going to be a challenge to the United States sovereignty and our security and our ability to make our own decision in terms of foreign policy. And so if you look at the political cartoons here, you see the peace treaty beaten up. The Treaty of Versailles has been beaten up by the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. You can see in the other cartoon that the gap on the bridge, the keystone, in fact, in this tension and this fragile peace in Europe after World War I, is the United States, and the United States is missing from that. Ultimately, this becomes the failure of the League of Nations because the United States, the chief architect of the Treaty of Versailles, in the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. So one way around that, in terms of getting away from the Senate, is to enter into executive agreements. And the president can enter into executive agreements with other nations. Here you see President Obama exchanging an executive agreement with Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan. These have the force of treaty, but they don't require the advice and consent of Congress. So the president can act just like an executive order has the force of law without Congress's approval. Executive agreements have the force of law without the Senate's approval as well. Let's talk about the power of recognition. When Teddy Roosevelt recognizes Panama in their effort in independence from Colombia, this becomes a key part of the story of Western Hemispheric economic security for the United States. We recognized Panama largely because we wanted control of their land, their isthmus, to create the Panama Canal, but the mere recognition of a country opens doors for diplomatic relations. We see that with Cuba now. We saw that with Nixon in China, as you can see here, when China meets with Chairman Mao Zedong. We also see it in our fundamentally deep relationship in 1948 that began with the State of Israel. And Harry Truman, recognizing, you can see here in the authorization, recognizes the government and the authority of the State of Israel is a key moment for that state, especially after World War II, and especially as we look at modern conflicts within Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East today. The idea of a persona non grata is someone who is not welcome. And so we have that tool, as do other countries, to expel people or not welcome people into our country. For example, the Ecuadorian embassy expelled the U.S. diplomat a couple of years ago for some leaked information that was put out there, and in response, the United States expelled the Ecuadorian diplomat from the United States. So persona non grata is a tool by which to say, hey, you country, or hey, you person, we don't like what you're doing, and we're not going to accept you as a legitimate guest in our country anymore. Now, when we talk about the foreign affairs powers, one of the chief ones that we look at, of course, is the commander-in-chief. The President of the United States is the civilian leader of the military, put in place by Congress on purpose to make this person a civilian. But he often delegates command to his military subordinates. The president can make an undeclared war, and the president as commander-in-chief can fight or send troops in to fight a war that's in the interests of national security. And oftentimes, the president is conducting these wars undeclared or these police actions under an authorization for the use of force that's presented by Congress. So when Congress authorizes the use of force, this becomes a permission for the president to enact the powers of the commander-in-chief. You can see here Abraham Lincoln on the battlefield with the generals in the Civil War at Antietam. You can see President Obama out in the theaters in the War on Terror, and of course what I like to call the G.I. Joe moment when George W. Bush lands the plane with the pilot and the aircraft carrier and declares active combat operations in Iraq over, and of course that mission accomplished. But the commander-in-chief power is one of the most commonly cited powers of the president that we look at. Now, I talk about undeclared wars. The United States has fought many undeclared wars since World War II, and this gives you an idea of kind of what we're looking at in places where we've targeted countries for military intervention, we've bombed countries to push them into a subservient relationship with us, and then of course assassination plots. The CIA has been really good at that. You can see here the United States has been very active in the globe since World War II, the last time we declared a war by the United States Congress. The Congress in 1973, during the Vietnam War, passed what we call the War Powers Resolution. And this is a wide-ranging authority given to the president that says the president can commit troops if the Congress has authorized the war, Congress has authorized the action through an authorization of use of military force, or when an attack on the nation or its armed forces has occurred, the president can act without the permission of Congress. But in this circumstance, the president has to report to congressional leaders within 48 hours, and that action can't last more than 60 days. So the War Powers Resolution gives authority to the president to conduct these wars and these police actions, these undeclared wars, as he deems necessary. The President of the United States also acts under the authority of Commander-in-Chief or Chief Diplomat in our security alliances that we're a part of. And these security alliances are treaty organizations. They're alliances that say when a member country is attacked or when a member country suffers from some sort of attack by an outside enemy, the United States and all members will come to their aid. Some of the most important that we're members of is, of course, the United Nations. And the United Nations also has within it what we call the UN Security Council. And the United States is one of the 15 members of the UN Security Council. In fact, we are one of the lead members with a permanent veto. And the UN Security Council is the arm of the UN that is used to authorize sanctions and sometimes peacekeeping or military force against a country because of their actions as they violate international law. The United States, after World War II, also is a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is one of our chief military alliances that we use to create security in Europe and around the globe. We're also an active member of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which acts much in the same way as NATO does. But the key part here is the U.S., when acting militarily, can choose to act unilaterally, or we can choose to use these treaty organizations that we're a part of to also get help and to strengthen our alliances as we act against enemies and against foes. We need to think about now what's appropriate. What's the appropriate use of military force? When should we step in? When should we step in for military issues, for strategic issues, humanitarian issues? And that's what we need to examine. So let's get to work.